Good evening from Frankfurt. For the first time with an audience. No, for the second time with an audience. We practiced last week. My name is Andrea Jürges. I'm the Deputy Director of the German Architecture Museum. And I'm very happy to have guests from Tel Aviv and Prague and Frankfurt here in Frankfurt with me. Tonight, we will continue our excellent series Context, Kontrast, Continuity, which we started in November 2020 when there was still a pandemic and we only did it online. So I'm glad that we're now in season 3. It's the 10th episode altogether. And tonight we shall talk about planning instruments in history and today. Something which I think is very vital and very important, and I hope we can learn from the past something for today, because we all face the same challenges. Let me quickly introduce the round, and I talk about more about the persons between the presentations. So, to my right is Vít Rečák, then followed by Anat Levy from Vít Rečák from Prague, Anat Levy from Tel Aviv, Jaron Hoffmann-Dishon from Tel Aviv, Christina Treutlein from Frankfurt, and Dr. Julius Reinsberg from Frankfurt. This series has been always discussing monument protection and urban development. And I'm very happy that Frankfurt is the partner city of Tel Aviv, because we both have monuments to protect. Your white city is already a monument, an urban, UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we hope to achieve that with some housing areas of the Neuen Frankfurt. But as we develop the series, we of course discover that not only can we learn from each other, but we can also learn from the past for today, and this is why we start today with this series. This entire series is possible thanks to the funding by the Federal Ministry for Housing, Urban Development and Building, as well as from the Freunde des Dam, so our association which supports our museum. We are tonight not in the museum. We are in a very interesting space called Danzig am Platz in the Ostend. Our museum is under renovation, and our interim space is for exhibitions is close by. And tonight we are actually part of a 2-day symposium which was talking about housing within the region here in the area. Just to give you the entire mindset. The weather outside is beautiful. We're tonight inside, and I hope, if not, we have so many watchers today, because everywhere hopefully it's finally spring. The series stays online on our YouTube channel, so it can be always re-watched. We shall start today with a presentation, a short talk, by Jaron Hoffmann-Dishon, who is a researcher at the Adva Center, a Tel Aviv-based think and do tank. I also want to have a think and do tank that monitors social and economic developments for the promotion of equality and social justice in Israel. His works at the Adva Center focus on housing and taxation policies. Jaron is a PhD candidate in sociology at the Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, writing a dissertation on the political economy of tax policy in Israel in the neoliberal era. That is some topic to write about. And I'm really happy that you're here, and we're really interested of what you have to tell us.
Okay, so thank you very much, Andrea, and I'll just start by saying thank you very much to the Liebling House in Tel Aviv for arranging this contact between the Adva Center and this discussion, and of course thank you, the Deutschen Architekturmuseum and the Ernst May Gesellschaft for here in Frankfurt for the invitation to take part in this discussion in this lovely venue. So you presented the topic of our discussion as planning instruments and on Tel Aviv, and I'm like going to say that I'm going to talk not exactly on housing, planning instrument, and not exactly on Tel Aviv, because I'll talk about housing policy in Israel. So it will be like a broader discussion on the Israeli side, and I'll give like a brief story or narrative on what is going on with the housing policy in Israel. And as you presented me and our work in the Advanced Center, you could understand that we are a think tank or a research institute that holds critical views on the current government, neoliberal government policies, and of course it will be reflected in my talk. So the housing policy in Israel, in short, is a story of a shift from a state or even nation-oriented policy to a market-oriented policy, in such that it neglected on the way the possibility to establish a public-oriented policy. In other words, it's a story of a country that today lacks a universal policy to achieve housing for all, which is like a term that I know it's being discussed now around the world, in Europe, like how to achieve accessible housing to all classes, to all the public, in all income deciles, etc. And our argue is that Israel nowadays lack of this aim or this goal of policy. So in Israel, the right to housing is not defined within the law. There is no constitution, a formal constitution in Israel. Actually, right these days, it's like a focal point of a tension, of social tensions in our country. And so there is no constitution that could guarantee like a legally right to housing for the public, or the responsibility of the government for housing to its citizens. However, since the establishment of the State of Israel, the Israeli government did consider itself responsible for handling all issues related to land and housing. In fact, the housing policy played an important role in realizing the goals themselves of the Zionist movement, and later on the Israeli governments, in establishing the State of Israel. The Zionist leadership, and after that the governments of Israel, used the housing policy actually to establish the economic development of the Jewish population in the new state. In the 50s and 60s, so I'll just say that whoever don't know, the State of Israel was established in 1948 after the end of the British mandate in Palestine, the land of Israel. So the Israeli state absorbed into its more than 1 million Jewish immigrants in a pretty short time, like in a decade, mainly from Islamic countries, Jews from Islamic countries, and from post-war Europe. During these years, the Israeli government took direct involvement in the construction of housing, established new cities that weren't existing before in the peripheral areas of the states, cities that until today are called development towns that were established by the state in areas that weren't populated or were scarcely populated by the Jewish population. And the state built them, established those towns, and actually built most of the housing units directly by the state in those towns. They did so with funding obtained from various sources, including I can add, from the reparation payments received from Germany after World War II. So in the state's first decades, some 330,000 housing units were built in all of the states. About 80% of them were public construction. So that the first figure was the overall construction in the state in those years, and 80% is what part of it was built publicly. So you could understand that the state and the government took a major role in the construction of housing in those days. So although this policy was successful in supplying the new Jewish immigrations with a house to live in and with successfully absorbing all this huge amount of immigrants, which like tripled the population of Israel in like a decade or a decade and a half, it also created substantial inequalities, which the consequences of which are still evident in Israel today. Until these very days, almost no public housing is located in Israeli-Palestinian municipalities, which are localities of Israeli-Palestinian citizens living inside, as part of the State of Israel. And these localities suffer until today from a lack of land and from lack of urban planning or not sufficient urban planning and low levels of municipal infrastructure. The housing policies of the 50s and 60s also created inequalities among the Jewish population between those who were housed in those poor quality public apartments in the periphery of the states, mainly the Jewish immigrants from Islamic states, and between those who managed to obtain private housing in the big cities in the center, which Tel Aviv would be the major example, but not only Tel Aviv. There were some like the existing big cities in the center of the country. So that's the story of the two first decades. The state withdrawal from housing began as early as the 70s, with the transition from direct public construction to what economists call demand-side interventions, mainly subsidizing mortgages and incentivizing private real estate developers. During those years, the states almost completely stopped building public housing and began even to sell some of the public housing units they built in the former 2 decades to the tenants. In doing so, Israel was even ahead of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK, where there privatizing public housing was a central element of the British neoliberal policy that Thatcher is like a main figure in this policy. Since the 2000s, there has been another withdrawal of the state from the housing sector. In these years, there was a sharp cut in the Ministry of Housing's budget. So also the demand side programs were cutted, and rent allowances and mortgage subsidies, all of that were slashed. The budget was slashed also. And in contrast, what we see until these days is an increase in state revenues from real estate taxes and from land sale. Actually, Israel is quite a peculiar example because the government itself holds in its own ownership 90% of the land of the states. Of all the land. It is true that most of this 90% is not in the urban areas. It's like in the rural periphery. But even in the urban cities, the state itself holds publicly a huge percentage of land, which is not very common, for example, here in Europe. And and paradoxically, in Israel, those who hold like right-wing economical views see this as a flaw. Sees that like because the state holds land, so prices rising or not enough housing is being built. That's like claims that being brought by right-wing economists and right-wing politicians. In my view and in our view in the Advanced Center, we see this as a paradox because the public land should have been made it easier to promote public policies and construction or allowing the construction of affordable housing and public housing on this land. So almost finishing. Today in Israel there is almost no housing outside the private market. Public housing exists in a very low percentage, aimed for very marginalized people suffering from poverty and other family and socioeconomic disadvantages. And there is no other alternative to private ownership in the sense of there is almost no non-profit housing. It's like a term that doesn't exist in Israel. And then I'll say something about the rental market. And even the programs now, the government like is trying and changing each when the government changed, the program changed, but they stay pretty much the same in the sense that they are limited in their scope of promoting affordable housing. This is especially a bad situation because since 2008, Israel has experienced a sharp increase in housing prices, like many other countries, which has affected all parts of the countries. Like in other countries, housing in Israel went through a process of financialization, in which housing became an investment property. The percentage of households purchasing apartments for investment increased greatly, and the involvement of banks and the financial sector in the housing market expanded. In recent years, more and more households, and especially the young middle class, are finding it difficult to obtain home ownership. And these households are going and moving to the private rental market. But the problem is the rental sector in Israel remains to this day almost unregulated. While rents are signed in contracts for 1 year, there is no open-ended contracts in Israel, and there is almost no long-term rental market. Most of the people, of the tenants living in rental homes live in a year-to-year contract and have to negotiate their rent and terms every year again. And of course, this is a total lack of stability and security of housing. So just to conclude again, what I briefly put like 70 years in 10 minutes of the housing policy in Israel, I want to conclude in what I said in the beginning, that the story I told is a story of a country that moved sharply from a housing policy controlled by the state interests to a housing policy controlled by the interest of the market and the private capital. We, the Advanced Center and the public, still continue to wait for a housing policy that will act in the interest of the public.
Thank you, Yaron. Let's discuss all points which may be raised by the different presentations all together afterwards. I think that's best. And I also want to thank the Lieblinghaus and the Ernst May Gesellschaft for really being in this program, in our series all together, and we always develop the program together. And it's been a very good trialogue partnership on 3 sides, if we include also, of course, our cultural department and the urban planning department here in Frankfurt, which are also part of our discussions. We have very good experts who shape the program. Let's switch to the next presentation, also from Israel. Anat Levi, she's an architect and curator at the Liebling House, our wonderful partner in this program, a cultural center for architecture, conservation and urbanism, where she directs the field of urban sustainability in collaboration with the Environmental and Sustainability Authority of the Tel Aviv-Yafo municipality. Her work includes practical research on the vision of the Garden City through exhibitions, artists in residence programs and community projects. Beyond the physical aspect, her research also addresses economic and social aspects that complement a holistic understanding of human-nature relationships in urban society. That's another big story to talk. Welcome, Anat, and I give you the floor and the control.
Thank you very much. So, also, thank you very much for the invitation and for the very good series that we are actually running for already a while. And it's always very interesting. So yes, today I was invited to talk about the special case of the White City and also its unique master plan in which it is situated. Although it was designed already almost 100 years ago, today it is still very relevant, maybe even than before. This is the plan that provides the city with its meeting places in residential buildings and their courtyards, in streets and public gardens, and also lays the foundation for the essential layer of green spaces that are crucial for the densely populated city facing challenges of climate crisis. So, Tel Aviv was not invented from the sands, as many of the story are telling, but was actually originated in its neighbor, Jaffa, one of the oldest port cities in the world. The first Jewish settlers that began to venture beyond the walls of the old city had the desire to establish a new autonomous Jewish settlements. And they settled in the 11 disconnected neighborhoods, each with its unique character and layout, but without any overall plan. Sorry. In 1909, the first neighborhood that symbolizes the establishment of the new city of Tel Aviv was founded. It was Achuzat Bait. It was planned as a modern garden suburb for housing, with wide streets, main roads, and close to the railway track, a lot of the modernism concepts and ideas. And the resident desire for a green neighborhood was expressed in their plan of the plots that was designed to have a house and a house garden with a big public space in the end of the new neighborhood, which hold in the center the big institutional the educational institution of the Herzliya Gymnasium. So in 1921, the British Mandate authorities required the local authorities to prepare a master plan in order to regulate the scattered construction seen in the slides before, and here you can see them in the map to the right. The Tel Aviv Council invited the Scottish town planner Patrick Geddes to study the city's potential expansion to the north, and after spending 2 months in the city, he produced a detailed report that provided a comprehensive overview of the Tel Aviv existing conditions and also a recommendation for its future growth. This report was later edited and published by the Liebling House as a book titled By Lives We Live, which is taken from his report, from his text. The Tel Aviv development was rapid, as also Aaron said, also in Israel in general, and by the time Geddes submitted his plan in 1925, the city's population grew from just a few thousands to 34,000. The city expansion and growth were accompanied by the arrival also of the large waves of Jewish immigrants from Europe. And the different built-up areas, often separated by stretched of unbuilt land, created fragmented urban system that was viewed as an obstacle to the city's future growth. Therefore, we can see a massive change between the building in the 20s and the 30s. The growing population, together with the fresh master plan that was based on the Garden City vision, was a perfect mechanism of the new modernist agenda of Tel Aviv, introducing the international style of Tel Aviv, later to be known as the White City. The aesthetic approach of the international style was partially driven by the need to provide housing for millions of people displaced by the First World War. Socially conscious architects designed modular and easily replicable buildings that could be mass-produced quickly and at an affordable cost. But in Tel Aviv, however, the international style took a bit of a different look. The buildings were designed by a large number of architects that came into Tel Aviv from all over Europe, who had been trained under the greatest minds of that time, Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, Auguste Perret and Adolf Loos. In their work in Tel Aviv, they represented the plurality of the creative trends of modernism, but they also took into account the local cultural quality of the site. And this is actually one of the significant aspects that emerged in the local style, is the climatic adaptation, and one of the unique things of the international style in Tel Aviv, actually. While in Europe, the ribbon windows that are very famous of Le Corbusier are most associated with the style, in Tel Aviv they were opened into balconies. Different architectural solutions were found to maximize air entry while reducing sun entry, like designing asymmetrical buildings mass to allow better air circulation and the use of light and shadow. So although many of the buildings were representing more bourgeois architecture for property owners, which is very relating to the first lecture, there were also some representations of the more social ideas of communal living in a garden city, like this example for worker housing, Meonot Ovdim. So the outstanding example of both a large collection of around 4,000 international style buildings and innovative town planning ideas of the first part of the 20th century had led UNESCO, like Andrea said before, to declare this part of the city as a World Heritage Site in 2003, the White City. As part of our activities at the Liebling House, also known as the White City Center, we are trying to make a splash between the past and the future, between preservation and development. We ask ourselves, what can we learn and adopt from the values and ideas of the Geddes plan about our current relationship with our natural and social surrounding in the city? Geddes was a man of a vision. Therefore, his plan can be read not only as a planning practice issue, but also as a framework for relevant questions about contemporary issues of housing and urban living. He was a mythical figure in urban planning, a biologist, but also a botanist and a sociologist and a city planner who worked at the end of the Industrial Revolution trying to improve the poor living condition of the slums. As a sociologist, he saw the importance of residential planning as a significant instrument for building a community. His approach to urban planning, elaborated in his book Cities in Evolution, emphasizes the need to integrate the city and its natural surrounding environment and the consideration of natural local characteristics like the sea, the different topography, humidity, and the vegetation. After examining his ideas in various places around the world and proposing unrealized city plans throughout the British Empire, especially in India and Sri Lanka, the invitation to create a master plan for Tel Aviv was actually an exceptional opportunity for Geddes to express these concepts in a plan for a whole new city. In 1925, after conducting his survey in Yafo and Tel Aviv, he submitted his 60-page written report, accompanied by actually only 2 maps, as a master plan for Tel Aviv, which, by the way, was Tel Aviv master plan until 2016. So on the right, we can actually see the cover of this report. And this is what we are relating as the Geddes plan, actually, which is this scheme, not really a plan. And to the left, we actually can see the statutory plan only took place only 15 years later in 1940s, sorry. And these 15 years led actually to significant changes in the original principles and a massive reduction in the green spaces. We can see that directly, very visually. Development pressures has created tension between the extensive public areas that's suggested by the Geddes plan and the private ownership of some of the same areas. The northern part of the areas, where you can see in the blue, light blue line, were actually in 1925 not yet under Tel Aviv jurisdiction at the time. But some of it was already owned by private owners, by private Jewish people. This highlights another important principle of the plan, besides the environmental one. There was also great importance given to the social aspect. The expansion of the plant up to the Erhalt Park laid the infrastructure for an affordable city, allowing new people to buy land on the outskirts of the plan and develop it, which also, by the way, facilitated the development of the Hebrew culture with the entry of artists into the city. So what are the instruments in the plan that allow the implementation of the garden city values? So Geddes is actually talking in his plans on a very big variety of scales of living spaces. Like he talked about the city, about the block, about the garden, about the house, about the residential building yard. Like he's examining really all aspects of living aspects, up until actually this is a picture of the book that which I showed before by Lives We Live, that he is actually also suggesting the vegetation catalog, you could say, for the white city. So the plan consists of a grid defined by two types of main streets, the one that are running from north to south, and the one that are running from east to west, which are also known as the boulevards of Tel Aviv, allowing leisure activities and also introducing the sea breeze from the west into the city. These are the Ben Gurion boulevards that are located on the border of the White City, then and now. So if we dive in a little bit, in between the intersection of the north and the south is received the home block, which is one of actually the most significant instrument, I think, of the Geddes plant. It comprises two rings of small residential blocks connected by small inner streets and organized around an open inner space, So the outer ring of these blocks are adjacent to the main streets, this allowing for easy access to light, air, and views. The inner ring faces inwards toward the block communal space. The narrow streets on this inner ring, known as the homeways, are designed for local traffic only, with a recommended width of 7 meters to minimize traffic and to save space. The homeways lead to the communal space, which can be accessed through pedestrian alleys known as rows and vine lanes. The central communal space is where residents can enjoy shared facilities. If we actually take the Geddes idea literally and simply put such a theoretical block in place, we will find out that the garden area is actually around 11% from the block area, which is pretty generous, I would say. And it is possible to see that the inner garden gives quality to the buildings and allows for absorbing density in a way that is crucial to the quality of life. So what did Geddes actually consider when planning a garden city, and how did he approach the garden? Geddes believed in integrating various green spaces to create an active and vibrant urban texture that offers the quality of life founded in a European garden suburb with a flow of fresh air, proximity to nature, and accessibility to open spaces. In Tel Aviv, he suggested combining different types of green spaces, including the boulevards, the Central Park, a botanical garden, block gardens, that would provide agricultural supply, enhance residents' mental health, and serve as a primary communal social value. He visioned the gardens as belonged to the residents, which is also very important, who were responsible for the cultivation and activities. Geddes believed that the gardens could serve as a communal gathering space, preventing the decline of private life in the city, like the idea of the village square. Did these values survive despite significant changes of the built environment? And how can we ask this question using other tools? As we approach the 100 years of Tel Aviv's Garden City Plan, we ask ourselves at the Liebling House how to formulate the city new green manifesto. To do so, we examine the principle expressed in the program on its various components. So in the home building program, we search for a new attitude toward the familiar term, the residential building, as a theoretical notion and also as a practice for sustainable city life. The program worked simultaneously on two platforms. One was an urban plan with residents in residential buildings, and the other one was actually an artistic residency program at the Liebling House, served as a base for information, study, and discourse on the subject. The residency program was followed by an exhibition presenting the personal visual expression of the participating artist, raising the question, what turned a building into a home? The Urban Block Garden exhibition showcases a broad study conducted for the Municipal Preservation Department and the Liebling House on the block gardens of Geddes, led by architects Ruth Liberty Shalev and Adi Harnoy. As part of the exhibition, a documentation studio was established in one of the gardens, the Ruth Garden, to collect and document the local heritage through embroidery, together with garden users. This alternative conservation practice can strengthen the community's connection and belonging to the garden in line with Geddes' vision. The process, which began as a pilot, is being now developed into a model that can be integrated into public participation processes in the renovation and development of the gardens. We aim to showcase the potential of the network of paths and alleys that still exist, but partly disconnected due to private ownership issues. These paths also offer alternative magical routes to the main crowded streets. Through collaborative work with the planning and beautification municipal departments, we are now researching ways to revive these paths and also developing guidelines for the maintenance and gardening of the gardens. As part of the plan to repurpose the green layer, we have created a pocket guide for touring the block gardens, which is part of a series of guides for alternative routes in the city, which we will continue in the future. Due to the unique nature of the block gardens, many of them are actually known only to the very close residents and not known to many other residents of the city. So the tour provides an opportunity to experience the unique character of the gardens and the importance of preserving their botanical and historical values, even in times of development, which is greatly influenced by the resident desire. In the current residency program, we host a multidisciplinary group of creators in the fields of planning, design, and environment, whose goal is to broaden the understanding of the urban block through research and documentation. Alongside the study sessions, the participants are developing a platform for applied research in collaboration with diverse audiences to gather knowledge from local communities about the block. By developing tools and playful methods, we are exploring the components and circumstances that make the block a significant unit in future urban planning for both professionals and city residents. So, the challenges that Geddes faced then still exist today throughout the city, the whole city, and maybe also in other cities, as you mentioned, because most of Israel is urban fabric. Dismantling the plan instrument to its components, similar to the Geddes holistic view, allows us to re-examine them today in accordance with regulations, climate conditions, and social and cultural zeitgeist. His vision was not fulfilled at a single moment in time, but rather it is a process that requires us to constantly update its components, both today and in the future, and adapt them to the changing city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette. That was a very interesting presentation. Oh, that's going to be interesting to discuss. Our third lecture is by Dr. C. Julius Reinsberg. He's a historian who studied Geschichtswissenschaften, history and Germanistic. What is that in English? Oh my God.
German studies? I don't
German
know.
studies, interesting, in Bonn and Gießen, with his focus on East European history. He did his PhD on here in Frankfurt on the topic of exile and remigration of the Neues Frankfurt. He was editor of the online magazine Moderne Regional, an important magazine for modern architecture, of course. He was also working for the Ernst May Gesellschaft prior to now being one of the he's now part of the cultural department here in Frankfurt. I'm sorry, I translated this on the go from German, so it might not be totally accurate, but thank you very much for being here, and you are going to talk about the re-migration of Neues Frankfurt instruments. Welcome, and over to you, and you have...
Yes, I already have it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, the 1920s meant a comprehensive renewal for the city of Frankfurt. You all know it. Between 1925 and 1930, up to 15,000 housing units were built in the city. At the same time, Frankfurt developed into a cultural and scientific center of the Weimar Republic. No less than the question of what the new man should like and what the life of tomorrow should be like was discussed in Frankfurt. And the experts around Ernst May did not leave it at the discussion. They confidently provided answers. The large-scale urban development campaign was made possible by the liberal Lord Mayor Ludwig Landmann and his administration. He placed the economic, infrastructural and urban development of the city at the center of his policy and did not shy away from large investments. It was shaped in the Department of Urban Planning, which was headed by City Councillor Ernst May. May and his colleagues developed new type solutions for housing, for the design of furniture, and for everyday objects, even for gravestones and for billboards. The Frankfurt innovations were presented to the professional world in journals and on lecture tours, in newspaper interviews, on radio broadcasts, and the specially founded magazine Das Neue Frankfurt. And this also made them known to a general public. The ambition always went beyond the city. Not only that solutions in other countries served as inspiration, no, the Frankfurt solution was fundamentally intended to answer global questions. The Frankfurt experts did a unique public relations job. They managed to get renowned architects such as Walter Gropius or Sir Raymond Unwin, Frank Lloyd Wright, and so on, to write guest articles in the magazine Das Neue Frankfurt. The magazine soon appeared with subtitles in French and English and gained subscribers in many countries around the world. One reason for that was that it was not limited to Frankfurt, but also described and also evaluated building project, cultural phenomena, or technical innovations from other countries and cities. Frankfurt architects, urban planners, and designers worked in a symbiotic relationship with the democracy. Thus, they were granted great creative leeway and competences by the elected city government. In return, they brought international prestige and importance to the city of Frankfurt. And Lord Mayor Ludwig Landmann received representative buildings linked to his administration so that he could hope to be re-elected. The experts of Frankfurt's Department of Urban Planning developed an almost outrageous self-confidence, which is illustrated in this graphic. It appeared on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the magazine Das Neue Frankfurt. It marks with arrows the countries in which people subscribed to the magazine. They all, you can see it, point to Frankfurt, its supposed center of modernity. This is where the universal architecture of tomorrow will be defined, so the suggestion goes. In 1930, the acid test for this claim came. With the world economic crisis, there was hardly any public money left for housing construction in Frankfurt, as in the whole of Germany. The Frankfurt Department of Urban Planning had to cut staff, projects were stopped or reduced in size. At the same time, Ernst May received a call from the Soviet Union, where numerous new cities were being planned in the course of forced industrialization. According to Soviet propaganda, the capitalist economic crisis had no effect to the USSR. In fact, the ambitious projects here could only be continued through the massive export of food, which led to famine. The foreign currency generated in this way was used to bring Western experts from Europe and the USA to the Soviet Union. Ernst May was therefore not a special case, but he was able to negotiate a job for himself and 17 of his Frankfurt colleagues that came with even more far-reaching powers than those in Frankfurt. Thus he became active for a Soviet building trust, the Bank, and designed standardized residential cities throughout the country. One focus was the economic centers that served coal mining and steel production, the Donbass in Ukraine and the Kuzbass region in Western Siberia. In fact, the Frankfurt standards were not the export hit that had been hoped for. It is true that the terraced building of the new cities in the USSR resembled the recently realized housing estates of the New Frankfurt. You can see it here on the left, the Westhausen estate from 1929, and on the right, the Avtostroy estate in Nizhny Novgorod, formerly Gorky. But they followed simply a general trend in international urban planning rather than actually copying the Frankfurt example. Only a few cases where Frankfurt design reproduced, such as this children's cabinet. It was originally designed for a Frankfurt kindergarten in the 1920s by Ferdinand Kramer and reproduced by Margarete Stelihotsky, the inventor of the Frankfurt kitchen, for the Soviet Academy of Architecture in the 1930s. Instead, the Frankfurt experts once again developed norms for floor plans, for buildings, for city districts, and even for ideal typical cities. Instead of Frankfurt norms and standards, they now produced Soviet norms and Soviet standards. And again, the designs were made known to a broad public in magazines. Weimar democracy was obviously not a necessary condition for the work of the Frankfurt experts. In their patterns of argumentation, they now linked it closely to communist ideology. The new cities and housings were described as the ideal prerequisites for the new society, the Soviet society. They were supposed to define a human everyday life that corresponded to the communistic utopia. Yet the recipient of these articles was not only Soviet society. I'm sorry, that was too far. Rather, Ernst May continued to write articles for German magazines and made lecture tours to Germany. Here he not only spoke about the building projects and the housing projects he made in the USSR, but also put the reports about the brutality of the regime into perspective. For the Soviet Union, he and his colleagues were particularly valuable for this reason. As Western experts, they had a much higher credibility as the Soviet propaganda or the Western European communists. Ernst May and his colleagues again made the deal they already had made in Frankfurt. They provided the government with credibility and international importance, and in return, they received far-reaching competences for their actual activities. However, the Frankfurt experts' activity was short-lived in the USSR. In 1936, the last of them left the country. The goal of planning and building entire cities in barely developed regions within a few months were unattainable. At the same time, foreign experts were now victims of one of Stalin's purge campaigns. Stylistically, the state leadership turned away from modernism to neoclassicism. Ernst May himself decided not to return to Germany. He left the Soviet Union in 1934 and would hardly have had a chance to work as an architect again in Germany, now in Nazi Germany. The Nazis had already fought the New Frankfurt project in the 1920s, and moreover, Ernst May's mother came from a Jewish family. Ernst May decided to emigrate to East Africa, to the British-administered Tanganyika territory. After a short and unsuccessful stint as a coffee farmer, he worked again as an architect. He soon opened an office in Nairobi. In the 1930s, he mainly designed homes for European settlers in Nairobi and in whole Kenya. They have formal and stylistic similarities to the buildings of Frankfurt. You can see it here, the Murray House, a private house in the village User River in Tanzania, and below the Kopfbau in the Römerstadt in Frankfurt, or the City House, a public house in Kampala in Uganda. But in their conception, they follow the individual needs of the clients, and they have hardly any parallels to Frankfurt or even to the Soviet housing constructions. After being interned as an enemy alien for some time at the beginning of World War II, Ernst May was soon released and earned the trust of the British colonial power. In 1945, his office drew up a plan for the urban expansion of Kampala in the British colony of Uganda. There is not much of the Frankfurt standards in this plan, nor of the Soviet ones. Once again, Ernst May defined new standards and norms, which in turn were to produce a new ideal human being and his everyday life. In doing so, he followed the specifications of his clients. In this case, it meant translating colonial society into architecture and planning. Ernst May designed 3 separate neighborhoods, each with its own social infrastructure and typified residential buildings. Maybe you can see it here. The classifications of the inhabitants was based on racial criteria. 1 quarter was reserved for the Europeans, for the British, and had the highest housing standards. You can see it below. The houses with a flat roof, with many rooms. It's very luxury. And 1 quarter was planned for the workers who had immigrated from India. The plan named it the Asian. The houses and the floor plans are more simple, and they are small, not so much rooms as for the Europeans. And 1 for the indigenous populations. The plan called them only the Africans. Here the planned housing standards were the lowest. You can see it, only 1 room, maybe a kitchen, maybe not, very small and very simple planning. The old deal of international importance for the state client on the one end and design freedom for the architect and for the planner, for the urban planner on the other hand, seemed to work out again. The British colonial empire sought new legitimacy after Second World War and used projects as this one to prove that it merely wanted to develop or even civilize the colonies. In fact, the opposite was true. The planned expansion not only replicated the social reality of the colonial city, it cemented it. The move of an African worker into one of the large houses of the European quarters was just as unlikely as a European resident in the African worker settlements. The planning was ultimately only realized in rudimentary form, but the street layouts have survived to this day. The Soviet Union and East Africa were not the only regions where architects of the New Frankfurt realized projects. However, it would be too much of a stretch to go into further examples at this point. However, even this brief selection shows the essentials. The Frankfurt norms and the Frankfurt standards were not an export hit. But the working methods of the experts of the Frankfurt Department of Urban Developments were. They were able to assert themselves in the most diverse political systems and cultural or geographical contexts. In this respect, the New Frankfurt established its very own international style. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julius Reinsberg. How fascinating, isn't it? Let's jump to Prague as next. Vidrečák from Prague is an assistant professor of the Faculty of Architecture in Prague. He graduated from the Faculty of Architecture of the Czech Technical University and continued in postgraduate program at ETH Zurich in Raumplanung. Vidrečák's profile covers a wide range of activities related to spatial planning, city development, real estate and building construction. Having started as a planner in design studio, he continued, and expanded probably, in the field of spatial planning and urban economics. Appointed as an assistant professor for the CTO in Prague in 1990, he focuses on economics and spatial planning and management of large-scale projects. Vid participated in several research projects dealing with the planning regulatory instruments, sustainability issues in European planning practice, and comparing methodology of planning processes in European countries. You're perfect for this evening. Thank you for coming. Since 1994, Vid has been active in both academic and private fields, including international real estate development companies as a senior project manager. He represents the Czech Association for Urban and Regional Planning as its vice president in the European Council of Town Planners. And he was also involved in the Davos Declaration 2018 editorial group, and he follows the agenda of Baukultur in the Czech Republic. Welcome to Frankfurt, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank the host for invitation, and I really appreciate the work your Gesellschaft and together with museum is doing. We are trying in our country to do the same, and I can imagine how difficult it is. I will speak today about current Prague discussion in terms of planning, but I will start with some context information, with a little bit history, because I think that the context and history creates the culture, and culture is crucial for planning. Then I will have some facts about Prague, but finally I will focus on the new metropolitan plan of Prague, which is being discussed currently. So this picture shows my DNA. You know, it was done by Israeli company, MyHeritage, maybe you know it, and it shows the influences from the east, from the south, from the west, a little bit from the north, which means that there is a lot of there is a mixture of different models we have in Czech in our hands, and what our writer Kontra described as a state of mind. This is my grandmother. You know, she was born in a Habsburg monarchy. A few years after Camille Sitte published his book Der Städtebau nach seinen künstlerischen Grundsätzen, which deals with city and beauty and art. Then she married in Czechoslovakia, a democratic state. By the way, this is the picture of a functionalist residential colony, Baba, similar to projects in Germany from that time. During the Second World War, she took care of her children. From that time, we still keep this central place model which were introduced that time. After the Second World War, there was a short period of quasi-democratic state, but then we celebrated the 1st May for 40 years, the way like it is shown here. And she died in 1990 when Czech Republic re-established democracy. You know, why I'm telling that? You know, she lived in 6 different regimes in her lifespan. You know, 6 different regimes. So, and all the regimes always declared that we want the best for you, and it will last forever. And so all that this influenced our approach, you know, that Czechs are extremely skeptical people, and it is extremely difficult to find a consensus within this type of society. Now some facts about Prague. This shows, this model shows data, big data from mobile phone operators showing the commuters coming to the city. There is an official population, 1.3 million people, but if you measure it by mobile phones, what the city recently did, they realized actually there is 1.5 million permanent residents there. So 200,000 is living physically there. They don't commute, but not properly registered, you know, because we don't have our system of registration enables that fact. Prague actually is responsible for 25% of economic output of the Czech Republic, and plus we have to count another 1.2 million people living in the surroundings. So it creates a big pressure on the city. It means that there is no balance between the Prague and the other regions. There is incoming population, incoming investment from abroad, which makes let's say the vision of Prague extremely difficult. On this other map, which shows purchasing power parity, it doesn't mean that you are how much do you really get in GDP per capita in absolute number, but it shows what you can buy for your GDP. And I was surprised by this map showing that Prague belongs to the richest regions in Europe. Actually, it has almost 200% GDP purchasing power than average of European Union. All the other Czech regions are much lower. They are somewhere between 60-70%. And so you can see on this map those cities like Prague, Bratislava, and Warsaw, which are, let's say, looking for a new position in this European kind of world. And it's difficult. I took this picture in 2017 in Expo Real, and I was shocked because Prague was not there, you know. Ostrava was there, Brno was there, they had some vision, but Prague has no vision. Prague actually didn't know what to do with itself. And now I'm coming to this metropolitan plan of Prague. This I think is a kind of attempt to change the viewpoint how the city shall be developed. It is being discussed. It is still not valid, but it's very likely that it will be proved in a few years. This is the author of the project, Mr. Roman Koutsky. He's an architect. Originally he's not a planner, he's an architect, who is very skeptical to this traditional way of spatial planning. And he even speaks about change of planning paradigma. What does he mean? So he set up some very simple, basic 4 rules he would like to follow. That first of all, that the city should be developed within a very clear boundary, within a very clean line, which shall not be crossed over by further development in the suburb. The second rule means, and he comes back to the beauty, that the city shall offer beautiful spaces for its residents. Further, he deals with height limits, not in terms that the height of buildings shall be limited, but in terms that there should be rules how to work with city panorama, with composition of the city, and how to incorporate it into the height policy. And finally, the rule of timing of the step. It means that all the steps which are foreseen in the plan shall be done in the way that it will work. It will not be in conflict among each other. Then he sketched 10 theses on the image of the city, which use the different language from the traditional, I would say, spatial planning. So at the very first, on the top of this pyramid, there is this vision of implosion. It means that the city should grow, but within the city. So Entwicklung nach innen. In the second round, he does take care about historical center, but as well as on the modern city which developed around the city center during the socialist time. On the third level, he speaks about city parks, Vltava River, because it's a crucial composition element of the city, and he puts very much stress on this green belt around the city, which should somehow block the further residential development to its surrounding. And on the lowest level, he speaks again about its height regulation, and then about the composition in terms of new bridges, new boulevards. It reminds me of a picture of Kedes in Tel Aviv. So in that those elements are actually creating the composition of the city. And finally, he sees a very big potential in the brownfields, which are still not being developed in Prague. And so finally, this concept shall in the same way deal with the metropolitan area, so not only with the city center, and with this is focusing on this ring of this touching area to the city surrounding. His thoughts are, because as I told you, he's not a planner, he's an architect, are rather I would say in sometimes aggressive in his planning family. So he sees that the planning should be very flexible, very flexible, so that and we shall not see the city as individual solitary buildings characterized by function, but more than like a structure which are alive. Then he also wants to he thinks that the city should create new values. So it doesn't mean just not to plan for plans, but to think what will be the added value of the new development of the city. And finally, he described the city as a living organism, and he thinks that even if we plan too much in the living organism, that it might sooner or later bring the city to the death. Of course, these ideas created a vibrant discussion among planners, politicians. There was a lot of discussion, negative references of different fields, particularly in the topic of monument preservation, because he thinks that the city should be open to state-of-art architecture, and that the city shall not be afraid of this new modern vision of development, because sooner or later the city will adopt these new layers in its image. That's physically how the map looks. On the left side, this is the current land use plan based on functional division. On the right side, this is the new plan, which prefers the structure and divides the city into the neighborhoods, some units with some characteristics of description of characteristics of future development. So big trees cast big shadows, and there was a very strong discussion during the time of preparation of this plan, particularly in terms of concept of high-rise building. Heritage people invited experts from UNESCO who wrote a report. It's impossible that Prague will be cut off the list of UNESCO protection areas. So after a year's exchange of expert delegation back and forth, they finally agreed on some concept of height regulation, in which the Prague was divided into the grids of some basic units, and each unit has some height limits in the number of floors, which doesn't mean that all the buildings shall be low, but it means that the high-rise building shall be located on certain areas to ensure a kind of composition of the city. Another issue is his, let's say, vision of city beautiful in current world. Unfortunately, the Czech planning does not have this similar system like in Germany and many other countries, when the land use plan, the Flächennutzungsplan, is a conceptual document binding for authorities, and then you have a regulatory plan, Bebauungsplan, which is then defining the rules, regulations for individual builders. Our land use plan combines both, it's conceptual as well as practical instruments for, and finally all the projects end up by such ladies who are responsible to issue the permits for documents, and we have a complicated society, the regulations are increasing. We trained people for 30 years to participate on project, and they are now very good, so they hire professional lawyers, to object the project. So I remember when I started my career, the yellow one is one sentence which says that the project is in accordance with land use plans, and today it's a novel. The clerks must write really a book. Some books have 100 pages, and everything is because of this one sentence. I really admire those people, and but I don't think this is the way how it should work. And this might be also a weak point of this plan, that if you have a good idea, but then if you translate it into the real world, what troubles it can happen. So finally, I hope that this plan will be approved, most likely in 2026, because this is the last year of the current political generation. I don't think they will switch over to the next election, but you see, it took almost 20 years to get a deal. And now, by the sudden, the Czech government issued in January a new standard of land use plans. So it means the government wants to standardize documentation. And in the first sentence, they say, if your plan is being elaborated now, finish it as it is, But as soon as you will make amendment or change it, then you should adjust it in accordance with this law. So it means all that white map have to be changed to this pre-standardized color map. So I think that the lifespan of a new plan will be very short. So Czech Republic is a country, continental country, typical continental country. There are hills everywhere, not big one, but hills everywhere. And as soon as you go to places like this, so that you have I would say, a long view, finally there are always hills on the horizon, and then you don't know what is behind, and people don't want to know what is behind, So the Czechs are really focusing on themselves, because they don't want to deal with unknown, And in the contrary, if you have at least my perception, that you are eager to know what is there, who are there, what are the people, that if you have a long, let's say, wide view, so I think it opens your mind. And if you have open mind, you are able to make a deal, an agreement, And I think that consensus is a principal issue for city planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I love that theory. Hills obstruct long views. We are also surrounded by hills, I think, lots of times. For our last lecture this evening, Christina Treutlein was born in Schweinfurt. She studied art history and cultural management in Berlin, Marburg, Naples, and Görlitz. She wrote a PhD on the architect Karl Hermann Rudloff, who's one of the protagonists of the Neuen Frankfurt. and she currently is deputy Geschäftsführerin. She works for the Ernst May Gesellschaft, and who drafted, together with the city of Frankfurt and the Monument Protection Authority of the state of Hesse, the draft for the Neue Frankfurt application to be included on the tentative list as a UNESCO World Heritage. Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Andrea. The project, called Neues Frankfurt, was an enormous urban development program implemented in the late 1920s under Lord Mayor Ludwig Landmann. It manifested itself in numerous new buildings erected over the course of a few years. Some of those buildings have put a lasting mark on the image of the city of Frankfurt. The Großmarkthalle, the Gesellschaftshaus im Palmengarten, hospitals, schools, churches, industry buildings, and many more. In addition to that, more than 12,000 apartments were constructed. All this was only possible through good and effective organization. Ernst May, director of the city building department, headed this organization. He said, quote, "Being in charge of an urban planning, the director of the city's building administration is obligated to manage the work in such a way that the development of the city as a whole results in final great unity in spite of the multitude of co-workers and employees. This goal can only be attained if the director of the building department unites in his hands all competencies that enable him to execute clear building strategy." End quote. And May further elaborates this, writing that, quote, the director is not supposed to do pretty work, but his task is to appoint qualified and, as far as possible, autonomously working department managers and executive organs heading his various work departments. End quote. The organizational structure of the building department mirrors these statements. As a consequence, Frankfurt's building department was a complex structure of numerous individuals. It could only function when everybody understood themselves as part of a team. Most employees had been systematically chosen by Ernst May himself, including many former employees he brought with him from the Schlesische Heimstätte in Breslau. Among these was one of his most important co-workers, architect Karl-Hermann Rotloff. He became the head architect of the Aktienbaugesellschaft für kleine Wohnungen, called ABG. Being in charge of some of the most well-known housing estates of the Neues Frankfurt, Römerstadt, Höhenblick, Niederrad, Bruchfeldstraße, Bornheimer Hang, Miquelallee, and so on, as well as several further small projects. The swift beginning of construction proves how efficiently the team worked. May was appointed as head of the building department on September 1st, 1925. Rotloff started his work on November 3rd the same year. After only 5 months, on April 1st, 1926, the first construction works began at Bruchfeldstraße. Construction of the Höhenblick housing estate began on April 20th, 1926, and the works for the building ensemble at Pestalozzi-Platz commenced on May 1st, 1926. The organization chart of the city's building department also reflects the great extent of Ernst May's field of action in all building-related matters. Contemporaries often stated that he was very commanding and implementing his goals. He would not allow any opposition in the meetings of the executives and of the boards of the ABG. He was also uncompromising toward his colleagues in the urban magistrate. With his co-workers and employees, however, he sought to establish a friendly, constructive relation, speaking of a big family. On one occasion, Rudloff wrote, quote, "My always diplomatic didn't want to hurt anyone," end quote. And Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky remembered that by conceding some autonomy in the design process, May, quote, "motivated his employees in order to bring out everything that can be brought out. Only then they do enjoy their work. And that was highly the case in Frankfurt," end quote. Trying to picture the workflow in an urban building department, one might tend to think that, as in other administrative institutions, work is carried out behind closed doors without any kinds of discussion, cooperation and compromise, and that everybody simply follows his bureaucratic rules of procedure. Yet the opposite was the case here. The coordination of all relevant departments and offices under the head of the building departments sparked an intensive exchange between the employees. Short distances facilitated communication and rationalized administrative processes. All this is suggested by Rudloff's letters. He emphasized that the design process and decision-making were the results of teamwork. Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky also repeatedly used the pronoun "we" when describing the projects she was involved in. In his letters, Rudloff often wrote about everyday work. On February 26, 1926, he wrote that, quote, "We had meetings with May every day until 10 or 11 at night. Afterwards, I used to be pretty worn out, since we had real battles," end quote. Battles, in this case, in this sense of verbal conflict, were not uncommon among the co-workers, since they were all strong personalities who wanted their architectural designs to succeed. Comparable to political struggles, co-workers and employees formed functions, and May often had to mediate between them. According to Eugen Kaufmann, the standardized floor plans were made in cooperation between the building department and the ABG. The same was the case regarding the designs for the famous Frankfurt kitchen. For the final design, either the ideas of several architects involved were combined, or only the plan of one single architect carried out the day. In many cases, the decision was based on economic aspects. The urban housing program is, in its entirety, was enacted by the Urban Council, which also ultimately ratified all construction plans. The plans themselves were created on the levels below. Concerning the house built by the ABG, this level was personified by May and Rudloff. However, it is improbable that May made the designs himself. According to Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky, he was an urban planner both by his education and inclination. A close examination of the plans also suggests that May had them presented by Rudloff. Together, they discussed the plans, and Rudloff occasionally had them to change as a consequence. As already mentioned, Rudloff was the head architect of the Aktienbaugesellschaft für kleine Wohnungen, ABG. The ABG was not an office or sub-department of the urban building department, but autonomous subsidiary company of the city of Frankfurt. Yet, the city owned 90% of the stock since 1923. Lord Mayor Ludwig Landmann was the president of the board of directors, and Ernst May acted as the vice president of the board of directors since 1925. Thus, there were personal links between the city and the ABG. The offices of the building department and the ABG were both located at Römerberg, in close proximity to each other. The extension of the housing program in spring 1926 necessitated the recruitment of new employees for the ABG. Since the old office facilities could not be expanded, the ABG moved to a new office building in Elbestraße. When Karl Hermann Rudloff took over as head of the architectural office at the ABG, the office had 3 employees. In 1926, when new construction projects had to be implemented, additional employees were recruited. At its peak, Rudloff's office had a staff of 10, all of them working at ABG as so-called technical employees. They usually focused individually on one project, yet they were all well involved about their colleagues' works as well, so that they were able to draw plans and designs for other projects. Given the great number of houses built by the ABG, with many of them not being standardized, it can be ruled out that Rudloff made the design of his own for every floor plan. Instead, he took care, quote, that the architects worked according to the same principles and the same guidelines, end quote. Just as one can say about Ernst May's work that not all Neues Frankfurt housing estates were designed by him, one can also assume that not all design plans in Rudloff's work were made by himself. The quality of the Neues Frankfurt buildings is based on the work effort of one big team consisting of many creative and dedicated individuals. Okay, thank you.
We now heard so many different levels of planning instruments. I'm impressed by the big variety which we have only in this room. There's many more, of course. And talking about team, when we talk about a team for urban planning, how many, I mean, yes, Ernst May had a very good team, and in my view, good people recruit even better people. That's the rule. I think Mr. May was very successful in this, if you just consider what was achieved in such a very short time. How was it in Tel Aviv with Mr. Geddes? Was he a lone person, or did he also have a team to work with?
In general, he worked alone, but I think it's an interesting point in the matter of the Geddes plan and his ideas, because a general idea of his planning in general is the activism actually of the citizens and the empowerment of the citizens. And in this way, also the actual layout and his actual principles of the plan are laying some kind of an infrastructure for the citizens, as I gave like one example for him, saying that the citizens will be the official in charge of what's happening in the garden. By the way, small note, today we call it a garden, but when he wrote the report, for him, because it was not as dense as today and everything, different challenges, for him it could have been a tennis court or a fruit tree garden in the same level. But he said that I'm putting the infrastructure, and the citizens themselves, they will put the content into it. And so in that matter, he didn't have a team, but I think his idea was very much about giving the tools in order for the city to grow from the plan onwards.
That sounds actually quite reasonable and very useful to current times. Julius Reinsberg, Ernst May again. Do you think he could, or what was his idea of citizen empowerment in the USSR or Africa? Was there any?
Yes, I think so, but not in our sense. The idea was to bring the ideas of urban planning and of architecture to the people. And he was successful. The people were speaking about architecture, about urban planning. The newspapers were writing about it. In Frankfurt, it was a very important topic. And I think that was his great success. I think it's not very sympathetic the way he reached his goals, but he was successful. And it's not to compare to nowadays, I think it's history, but it's an interesting chapter of Frankfurt history and of the international history of architecture and urban planning, I think.
So if we now switch, if we now take Mr. May's approach and Mr. Geddes' approach to Prague, how would you compare it, the metropolitan plan of Prague, with the two different approaches?
I mean, maybe I'd like to let's say come back to this teamwork, because city planning is a really teamwork, and unfortunately, during the socialist time, there were huge state institutes specialized on planning. There were many experts there, but all the system was completely atomized in the 1990s, so privatized, and the teams split into the little teams with 3-2 people, and they compete for works in ad hoc public tendering. Luckily, Prague and other big cities kept basic teams with experts, so that the master plan is being prepared by a strong team of experts in Prague. But this is not the case in our cities, and this is not the case in regions, which create a huge problem because you lose continuity, you lose expertise, and the profession somehow disappears.
So talking about continuity, I think I really look forward to visiting Tel Aviv one day and to explore all these gardens. Does this actually work? So does the taking care of the gardens by the citizens, is that a continuous process still nowadays?
Not exactly. It's completely a public space maintained and planned by the municipality. In our days, everything about like the public participant processes are in a very development stage, specifically in Tel Aviv. The closed community is very, very, very involved in the development of the gardens. they're being asked, like, what is their vision, what do they want to do, and in that way, the municipality in nowadays is somehow, yes, an executor of the residents' will. But I must add to that this is actually one of the reasons that we are doing this kind of community projects to expose the research, to raise again to discussion the values of the praxis, the historical, the botanical, the cultural, because the city is getting very dense, and those gardens are like a magical thing that even that still even exists, because I flew today into Frankfurt, which is surrounded all by the greens, and you were talking about that as well. This is not the situation in Tel Aviv. Every open space is really under pressures of development, and
so Yaron, could you imagine that a metropolitan plan as Prague is aiming for could be drawn up in Tel Aviv nowadays, and giving thoughts to what can be built, how high, or where are the dense areas and where are the green areas? Or would you wish for it?
I'll try to connect what I heard from the very interesting lectures to like my point of view and our point of view dealing on social equalities issues. I think what we were hearing today, this evening, is there are cities where when city planners and architects strive to plan or to create a good city, the problem arises when they actually succeed. Because when the city, or where the state in which the city is dominated by private market logics and regimes, this means if it's a good city to live in, what happens? Prices rise, right? So that's what we see in a lot of cities around the world, and that's actually a major problem that is happening today in Tel Aviv. It's the housing prices in the city itself of Tel Aviv are the highest in all of the country, and in the center, in the like white city center, the really beautiful place to live is the most high price, and it's becoming a problem in the sense that a lot of people can't afford to live there. And it's a problem not only in the sense of that it's unjust or it's unequal. It's a problem for the city itself, because cities which only rich people could live in are just not sustainable. And this is the problem that a lot of cities nowadays in the world are challenged by. So I think we heard here this evening, like what I think is the challenge of the cities, like in our times, like how to create good cities, beautiful cities to live in, with using all of these past and present architecture and urban planning ideas of creating like a good place to live in, right? But keeping those places affordable for all of the people. I think we heard like in the Israeli case, but I think like from my knowledge or what we heard today, that's the story in other places. That when it was made public, in a lot of cases, it wasn't so nice and beautiful. And when it was made private, there were cases that it was like made successfully, but then now it's getting not affordable to live in. But I don't think it's I don't think it can't be done. I think keeping those two sides in mind and striving to accomplish both is approachable, can be done just if you decide that that's what you want to do, like to build, to think of and to strive on, to create good cities, but also just cities. So if I'm just like taking a different part of a different like view on your first question on teamwork, I think here is also a needed teamwork, so that cities and our places that we live won't be planned only by architects and urban planners, but also by people, like by professionals who are viewing like the economic and social consequences of like policies, housing policies and planning policies, and how like housing is being maintained, being purchased, being rented.
So how is it in Prague? I think that's a very valid point. We can't have architects and urban planners rule the entire development of cities. I think sociologists are as important to understand the fabric of a city. How do you go about it in Prague with your metropolitan?
I would like to react to your comments, which I fully agree with. I mean, there is an issue of it's a mixture of different reasons. First of all, the cities competes, cities competes, and they compete on international markets currently, and the winners offer always the best conditions, mainly for jobs. I have students every year. They come all over the country. I always ask, who will go back home? 20 students, 2-3 hands. 15 wants to stay in Prague or in London or whatever. But not back home. It's because of the power of the, let's say, the jobs they can get in those cities. Secondly, there is a very short-term vision. The political period is 4 years, so it's extremely short, and it's difficult to convey experiences from the past or from a different countries to your current situation. You always react late. In Prague, we did a horrible mistake in early 90s when we privatized public housing. Hundreds of thousands of apartments went to private hands, and currently, because the people were generally poor, so it was kind of a how to improve their social status, that instead of paying 300 crowns per month, which is 10 euros for rent, they could get an apartment for, I don't know, 1,000 euros that time, And suddenly we see that the gaps between rich and poor are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And with 20 years we thought it will be solved out somehow, but now we see that there is no solution for those people, and we have no apartments at all. It's gone, and nobody knows what to do with that.
Oh, that was a discussion we had the last 2 days, also at the Große Frankfurter Bogen Symposium, and that raises for me the question: can a capital housing market solve any housing problems? I read this book by Doc Sanders about the arrival city, where he clearly states if you are in the developing countries, people should own houses, they should start owning land so that they can really be part of the society, improve whatever they use the land for or the house for, sell it and get money and create savings, etc., etc. But if I look at our European history we were a rental market, at least in Germany, in the Czech Republic, in Tel Aviv, it's at least partially still true in Vienna, in Austria, and I think, are we missing something here? Are we missing something important here? The main reason why we can't afford housing is we don't have a rental market anymore. We're losing it because now we get into this idea of everybody should own an apartment? Or is that then too radical and say, no, that's not true, there must be a grey in between? But I'm really seriously questioning if a market can solve a housing issue. How do you see that? I mean,
I think you're correct. Like the Israeli case is a case when that answer was that question was answered like a long time ago. The Israeli policy was aimed to ownership since its establishment, and even though, as I said in my talk, the state built a lot of the apartments in its first decade, it was aimed. They did it like because there was no private capital to build, so they did it. But they thought they should like give it or sell it to the tenants as fast as they can, and that's what happened. Like as I said, it happened in Israel already in the beginning of the 70s and continue on, and it continues to these days. Like if you look at the numbers of what remained out of the public housing in Israel, we are almost the lowest in the OECD countries. Like we have like 2% of our housing units being public housing. And as I said, the governments are still thinking that like they need to think only on pushing for home ownership. But the reality is going to another direction, because more and more people can't afford now to buy apartments. They're just staying in the unregulated rental market, which is still not being thought about seriously, like what to do with it, how to make living in rental market a good, secure, long-term solution for people, for households. Actually, Tel Aviv itself is beginning to think about it, and I know like people inside the municipality that are trying to think and understand like that they can't go on like this, like they can't afford to be so unaffordable because of the reasons we talked. But I think in the Israeli case, we find that even though municipalities have things to do, they are limited. They're quite limited by the centristic governance by the state. And if the government, the state government won't change its approach, municipalities in Israel will have a hard time to do so. So, as I said, we are still waiting for that change to happen in the state level.
Thank you. In the Czech Republic, I had the impression that the cities in the Czech Republic, according to your lecture, are very much, it's up to themselves how they organize it themselves, how they plan things. So there's not something like a state pressure to behave in a certain way as a city development, or is that true?
Yeah, the city is independent. Coming back to this real estate market, the real estate market behaves not in the standard conditions, because there are many reasons, theories, but it is already now the state actually intervene in a way that people are not on the streets, that they get subsidies, but this is not coordinated with the municipalities, which are responsible for strategy of development of residential market. I think that you always have to find some balance, but as I said, you always react too late. So I mean, at least the state and the city should find a way how to improve that situation, because otherwise you have tremendous state subsidy for people who cannot afford to pay rent, which does exist, but on the same time the municipalities are not motivated to solve the problem of their inhabitants, so that you have to find a different way how to change the flow of money.
Money is the problem, and public investment might be the solution. Is that the very short summary of our discussions on instruments? One question: if you could take one planning instrument, let's say from the Geddes plan, or from Ernst May, or from the history of the Czech Republic, which one would you love to pick up again and throw at your politicians and say, use that? Which one would it be, most likely? Annette.
Actually, it's interesting because the the latest idea that I'm dealing with in these days, like from the research of Geddes, is the idea of planning through houses. I mean, all the conversation that I talk about the residential block and this urban unit, he addresses it as the urban planning is thriving from the urban block outwards, which is, again, in general and very briefly, very short from the modernist planning approaches and urban planning approaches that we know that put down some kind of a layout of a city and start to fill it. And in that manner, and after your last question, I think that rethinking, somehow the development of the city through some kind of modular, basic unit that is acts as a kind of an ecosystem that gives the people their very basic needs of a certain size of a community, the garden again, or the certain size of the open space, the public building, or like pointing all the very first needs in some kind of a unit that can grow. And of course, this unit is also giving the privilege for housing. I'm not telling if it's by ownership or regulated rental, but some kind of a solution. These days, I think it's a very interesting instrument for future urban planning.
Okay, thank you very much. That is a very good idea, which we may consider also here. Jaron, what is your instrument which you would like to?
Thank you. I was very interested, like before the event and now, to learn more about the new Frankfurt ideas and planning, in the sense that it was a thought or an experience of planning for the people, or thinking about the whole needs of the people, like the human beings, and how to put it in like the structure of a house or in a neighborhood, and etc. And I think what we nowadays are lacking in our decision-making areas of all the social and economical decision-making is this sense. It's like, how do we design our policies that will be in the benefit of the whole people, while considering their whole needs as human beings, and not only like as consumers or like economic beings, living workers. So I would think that could be a good idea, like to get inspired by this people who thought how to integrate like the people needs, the human being needs inside their professional, their planning, to today economical and social policy making.
Thank you. Christina.
I think teamwork is a very good instrument, but not like in the 1920s. I think today we must include much more citizens, and we should need a vision, like Geddes said, a big vision. Yes.
Thank you. Julius Heinsberg.
I liked your conclusion. But moreover, I think the great public relation job in the New Frankfurt was made. That people talk about architecture and about their city. I think it's not a topic for experts. It's a topic for the people, and they can love the new architecture. They can hate it, but they have to talk about it. And that it was what in the New Frankfurt, what the experts of the New Frankfurt reached. Everybody in Frankfurt, I think, had an opinion about the New Frankfurt and about the planning, the settlement. Everybody knows Ernst May. I'm not sure of nowadays everybody knows Mike Joseph or maybe the Lord Mayor everybody knows, but I don't know everybody has an opinion about architecture or urban planning in Frankfurt. And I think that's an instrument we can renew in Frankfurt.
In Prague, everybody's talking about the metropolitan plan?
No. You asked about specific planning tools. So I meet twice a year my colleagues from other European countries in the form of this European Council of Planners. You know, I go there more than 20 years every year, and no one is happy with the current planning tools they have currently in the countries available. You know, no one. You know, I mean, so. And I think this is something characteristic, no? Because it is not by chance. So I mean, it is not the tools, but I think that it depends on people. You know, depends on people if they are willing to respect, to find, let's say, consensus, and if they don't, then none tools will help you.
Thank you very much. It's always up to the people. That's a wonderful last words for this session, and that doesn't make it any easier, of course. You have to now we all have to find the right people. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to the audience here and online. I have one factual thing to add. If you need points for the Architektenkammer, you can get them because Philip has the, here in Frankfurt, he has the right thing where you have to sign. And if you followed our lecture on Zoom, you can just email us and we send you the certificate. Our next evening in this series will be on the again a Thursday. We have Thursdays booked. 1st of June, master plans. We have a visitor from Milan. We will have a speaker from Tel Aviv and also, of course, speakers from Frankfurt. And then our last event in this series is on Thursday, again, 6th July. We do it every 4 weeks. It's about housing. It's about housing and resiliency. It's about housing and resiliency, sustainability and design, management, maintenance, gardening, and agriculture. Here we have, of course, somebody from Tel Aviv and from Frankfurt, and hopefully also from another partner city of Frankfurt, because I think we all gain from a multi-perspective in these discussions. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very good evening, and hope to meet you again.
Thank you. Thank you.